Welcome to the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham, and today we begin. Well, first of all, why griot? Some of you may already know what a griot is. It's a storyteller, a keeper of memory, a person who holds the past and pass it to the future. A griot doesn't just entertain you. A griot explains who we are, where we've been, and where we're going. So when I say I'm the sci-fi griot, I'm telling you we're not just talking about shows or movies. We're talking about what they teach us. This podcast exists at the intersection of imagination and reality. We're going to talk about science fiction, but not just as entertainment. It's about the worlds we dream about, the futures we imagine, and the lesson hiding in our favorite shows and movies. We're going to talk about shows like Star Trek, Star Wars, Babylon 5, Marvel, Battlestar Galactica, and many other shows and movies, and even others that you may suggest to me to watch and comment on. We're going to talk about these stories and what they say about leadership, culture, power, identity, fear, hope, and the future we're actually building. This isn't a recap show. It's not about ranking or trivia. It's about meaning. So today I want to start at the beginning, not with a franchise, but with a question. Why does the future still matter today? Science fiction didn't just entertain me growing up. It shaped how I thought. When I was a kid, I was one of those lonely, isolated, to myself, very shy kid. They called me Steve Urkel from the show Family Matters because I was skinny, wore these big nerdy glasses. In middle school, I used to draw science fiction comics, even of me being a captain of a ship, saving my school from the evil bullies in school. And actually, even today, I still have those drawings. But I love science fiction, spaceships, traveling to strange new worlds, learning about different planets, aliens, and languages, parallel universe, duplicates, and all sorts of sci-fi stuff. All that stuff just pulled me in. As a kid, science fiction was one of those few places where big questions were allowed, such as what does leadership look like? Can people change? Does progress require sacrifice? Can humanity actually do better? But there was something else happening too. For a long time, the future didn't look like me. At least that's what I thought growing up. And yet I kept watching because even when I didn't fully see myself, I saw possibility. Science fiction offered a strange kind of hope that humanity could grow beyond its worst instincts. Representation in science fiction isn't just about visibility, it's also about permission. When you don't see yourself in the future, a quiet message is sent that you're temporary, you're optional, you're not essential for what comes next. So when science fiction places people of color in position of authority, intelligence, or moral complexity, it does something very powerful. It says, you belong here too. In the Star Trek franchise in 1988, I was first introduced to Star Trek The Next Generation around about the second season. My father started watching, and we would sit as a family watching the new episode that come out every week. I really got hooked on the crew of the Next Generation. The characters that was introduced in the Next Generation was very alluring to me. The series also pushed me to watch Star Trek, the original series, which was just as entertaining and enjoyable. I really got to really enjoy Captain Kirk and the crew of the original Enterprise. In 1993, Paramount Studios introduced Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It was the first African American male lead character in the Star Trek franchise. Not a stereotype, not a joke, a man who commanded armies, diplomats, and starships. Benjamin Lafayette Sisko. He had the weight of a galaxy on his shoulders. He wasn't just a black guy in space. He was an African American man who shaped the destiny of nations, of empires, and even civilization. That's why characters like Captain Benjamin Sisko mattered. Not because he was perfect, but because he was allowed to be complex. He struggled, he doubted, he made hard choices, and the universe responded to him. And that mattered. Star Trek wasn't just futuristic, it was aspirational. It imagined a humanity that solved poverty, moved beyond racial hierarchy, chose cooperation over domination. But what made Star Trek different wasn't the technology, it was the values. Star Trek wasn't defined by firepower, it was defined by restraint. And that idea stuck with me, that true power is knowing when not to act. Star Trek asked the question, what kind of people do we have to become to deserve this future? And that question still matters. Science fiction doesn't teach with lectures. It teaches with dilemmas. It puts characters in situations where every option has a cost. There is no clean answer, and leadership sometimes requires loss. And those stories stay with you. They ask, would you compromise your values to save lives? Is peace worth discomfort? Who decides what's necessary? These aren't science fiction questions, they're human ones. I'm not a critic. I'm not here to rate episodes. I'm here to talk about what it meant to watch these stories and movies from a unique perspective. Because let me tell you something, science fiction hits different when you walk through struggle. Perspective shapes interpretation. Watching science fiction as an African American male, as a leader, a father, an educator, changes what you notice. You see who gets grace, who gets blamed, who is allowed to fail and recover, who is judged permanently. You listen differently when power is discussed. You question differently when order is valued over justice. That doesn't mean one perspective is better. It means different perspectives reveal different truth. And that's what this podcast brings. This podcast exists because we need spaces for thoughtful reflection. Not outrage or not hot takes or not endless debates. Just space to think, to slow down and ask, what are these stories really telling us? Why do some futures feel hopeful and others terrifying? What does sci-fi reveal about our fears right now? This podcast isn't trying to give answers. It's trying to ask better questions. This podcast isn't about memorizing ship registries or looking at warp core schematics or what ship can defeat another ship. If you're looking for that, there's a million people on YouTube waiting for you. This show is about meaning. We're taught culture, representation, hope, struggle, maybe even a little politics, leadership, humanity, sacrifice, what science fiction teaches us about ourselves. Because when sci-fi is done well, it doesn't show us aliens, it shows us who we are. So up to this point, I've talked about why science fiction matters to me and why this podcast exists. But now I want to tell you where we're going next. Because the next few episodes aren't random conversation. They're connected. They form the first arch of this podcast. In episodes 2, 3, and 4, we're going to explore a single idea from 3 different angles. What is science fiction really trying to tell us about ourselves? We'll start by asking whether science fiction is simply reflecting the world as it is, or warning us about the future we're creating. Then we'll ask whether we're actually listening to those warnings or just consuming them as entertainment. And finally, we'll confront the most difficult question of all. Who gets to survive the future that's being imagined? These aren't abstract questions, they're moral ones, human ones. And they show up again, and again. Whether we're talking about a show like Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica, Marvel, or even The Expanse or many other more. This first mini-series set the foundation for everything that follows. I want to start the podcast here with these questions for a reason. Because before we talk about characters, before we break down episodes, before we can analyze leadership, decision, or moral dilemmas, we need to understand the lens we're using. Science fiction isn't neutral. Every future imagined on screens carries assumption about power, assumption about justice, assumption about who lives matter, assumption on who lives are negotiable. If we don't slow down and examine that foundation, we'll miss the deeper story. This first arch is about learning how to read science fiction differently. Not as prediction, not as escape, but as conversation. A conversation about fear and hope, about progress and consequence, about what we're willing to protect and what we're willing to sacrifice when the stakes are high. Once we've asked those questions, everything else makes more sense. Every captain's decision, every war story, every utopian dream, every Desperate warning. So that's where we're headed next. In the next episode 2, we'll ask the first question directly. Is science fiction a reflection of who we are or a warning about where we're headed? We'll explore that through Star Trek, through Battlestar Galactica, The Expanse, and Marvel. We'll start building the framework for how this podcast approaches science fiction storytelling. This is the Sci-Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to imagine carefully. And this is only the beginning. So I want to thank you for listening to the Sci-Fi Griot. If this spoke to you, share it. Hit follow. Rate the show. Send it to a friend who needs to hear that the future still has room for them. So until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and remember, the future needs you.